Lucas had heard the rumors, the eerie stories about Oak Ridge, stories of a village that vanished every few decades, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. But he had always dismissed them as nothing more than ghost tales. That is, until he found himself driving through the thick fog of the woods late one night, with no sign of life for miles. The road stretched endlessly before him, and as he rounded a curve, he saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. But it wasn't the warm glow of a house. It was cold, unnatural, and it called to him. Lucas slowed the car, his eyes locked on the flickering light in the distance. The fog had become thicker now, almost suffocating, and the eerie silence was only broken by the sound of his tires skimming over the wet asphalt. His grip tightened around the steering wheel as he drove closer. The light was coming from the edge of the woods, but the path was unfamiliar. He had never seen anything like it before. As he approached, the light grew brighter, and then, as if by some invisible force, the fog began to clear, revealing an old, decaying sign. "Welcome to Oak Ridge." Lucas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Oak Ridge was supposed to be miles away from here. In fact, he hadn't even seen a sign for the town until now. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave, but something held him in place. The town had disappeared for years. There were no reports of anyone living there, yet here it was, in front of him. The whispers seemed to intensify as he stepped out of the car. "Go back," the voices seemed to echo, louder now, coming from all around him. His pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his ears. But there was no turning back now. As he stepped onto the road, the ground felt strangely soft, almost as though it was absorbing his every step. The air was colder, the shadows longer. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, that something was waiting for him to make a move. And then, as he ventured deeper into the village, he saw them, the figures, shadowy forms standing in the corners of the streets, their eyes glowing in the dim light of the lanterns. They didn't move. They just watched. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he took a hesitant step forward, his mind racing with confusion and fear. The figures remained still, their eyes piercing through the fog, watching him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of his footsteps crunching against the gravel. The fog, now dense and suffocating, seemed to move with him, closing in tighter with each passing moment. His heart pounded in his chest, but something in him, something primal, urged him to keep moving forward. Perhaps it was the strange compulsion he felt, the need to uncover the truth. What was Oak Ridge? Why had it disappeared for so long, only to reappear like a ghost in the night? He turned to look back at his car, but it had vanished, swallowed up by the creeping fog. His only option now was to move deeper into the village. As he walked down the cobblestone streets, he noticed that the buildings, though old and dilapidated, seemed untouched by time. The wooden shutters on the windows were cracked, the doors hanging loosely on their hinges. Yet there was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the town had been frozen in time. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just the unsettling quiet that wrapped itself around him like a shroud. The lanterns lining the streets flickered, their dim light casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him, as if reaching out. He stopped in front of a large, crumbling house at the end of the street. The door creaked open, as if inviting him in. His pulse quickened, the air growing heavier with each breath he took. Inside, there was no dust, no signs of decay, just a cold, stale air that hung in the room, thick with the scent of something ancient. And then, from somewhere in the shadows, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come." It was a soft, melodic voice, almost hypnotic, but filled with a sense of dread that made the hairs on the back of Lucas's neck stand up. He froze. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more alive, closing in on him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the pitch-black darkness of the house. The silence in the house was suffocating. Lucas's breath echoed in the stillness as he fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling. The light from the screen was feeble, casting long shadows across the room, but it was enough for him to make out the outline of the walls lined with old portraits, their faces obscured by age and dust. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the temperature seemed to drop even further, as if the house itself was alive, breathing with him. Suddenly, a low creaking sound broke the stillness. It came from the hallway outside, followed by soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was approaching him. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and his heart raced. He wasn't alone. The voice, soft and haunting, whispered again, but this time it came from directly behind him. "You shouldn't have come." Lucas spun around, his pulse pounding. The room was empty, just the portraits staring back at him with their hollow eyes. The house seemed to be closing in on him, the walls pressing in, suffocating him with their oppressive energy. He was trapped. In that moment, the floor beneath his feet groaned, and the house seemed to shift. The air thickened, like the entire building was breathing in sync with his own panicked breaths. Lucas's mind screamed for him to leave, but his body was frozen. His legs refused to move. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, his eyes fell on the door at the end of the hall. It was cracked open, and a dim, flickering light spilled out. Compelled by something he couldn't explain, Lucas walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, the sound of his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. When he reached the door and pushed it open, a cold breeze rushed past him, and the village of Oakridge revealed itself in all its eerie, unsettling glory. The streets were empty, but the shadows between the buildings seemed to move, and the once flickering lanterns now burned with a cold, unnatural flame. He could feel eyes watching him, eyes from behind broken windows, from hidden corners. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw them. Figures standing in the darkness, their faces obscured, just like the figures he'd seen earlier, but now they were closer than ever. Lucas's pulse hammered in his ears as he stood in the doorway, staring into the eerie streets of Oakridge. The village was as silent as death, but it wasn't the silence that unnerved him. It was the feeling of being watched, the prickle of eyes on his every move. The shadows between the buildings swayed, twisting as if alive, shifting in the corners of his vision. He could hear whispers now, faint but unmistakable, curling around his mind like smoke. "Don't look at them," the voice warned again, this time louder, clearer. It was the same voice, the one from the house. He couldn't tell if it was coming from the shadows or his own mind, but it made him freeze, a cold sweat trickling down his spine. He forced himself to take a step into the street. As his foot hit the cobblestones, a sudden gust of wind swept through the village, scattering the fog and pushing him forward. The temperature dropped sharply, and his breath turned to mist in front of him. It felt like the very air was trying to suffocate him, to pull him deeper into the village's grip. The flickering lanterns cast distorted shadows, bending unnaturally in the wind, and the figures watching from the windows seemed to grow in number, their glowing eyes gleaming like predators waiting to pounce. His every instinct screamed for him to turn back, to run, but the compulsion to move forward was too strong. He couldn't explain it. He had to find out what was happening. The village seemed to pull him closer, as if it knew his deepest fear and was feeding on it. And then, as if guided by some force, his eyes fell upon the town square. A large, broken fountain stood at the center, its waters long dried up. But there was something different about it tonight. The stones around the fountain were cracked, but in the center of it, where the water had once flowed, a single pale light glowed softly. The light flickered like a candle in the wind, casting a strange, unsettling glow across the square. Lucas stepped closer, his feet dragging with an unnatural heaviness, as if the ground itself was resisting him. As he approached the fountain, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Don't touch it," they pleaded. But Lucas couldn't resist. He knelt down beside the fountain, his hand hovering over the glowing light. Before he could make contact, the light expanded, enveloping his entire hand, sending a shock of cold through his body. The ground beneath him shook violently, and the whispers turned to screams. Then, as suddenly as it had all started, everything went silent. The village, the shadows, the figures, they were all gone. Oakridge had vanished. In its place was only a vast, empty field. No houses, no people, just endless flat land stretching into the horizon. The wind howled through the empty field, but there was no sign of Oakridge anymore. No village, no eerie figures, just a vast, desolate expanse of nothingness stretching as far as the eye could see. Lucas stood there, his heart still racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The memories of the village felt like a distant dream now, fading quickly, as though the village itself had never existed. But he knew it wasn't a dream. The strange compulsion that had pulled him into Oakridge was still with him, a deep, unsettling feeling in his chest. He looked down at his hands, trembling, but there was no trace of the eerie glow he had felt earlier. The village, the figures, and the mysterious voice were all gone, but they hadn't left him. He turned around one last time, scanning the empty field, expecting to see something, anything. But the only thing that met his gaze was the same emptiness. No signs, no clues. It was as if Oakridge had never been there, like it had been erased from existence. He couldn't understand what had happened, why he had felt so drawn to the village in the first place. As the wind picked up, Lucas began to walk away, each step feeling heavier than the last. His mind was still reeling from the strange events, the whispering shadows, and the vanishing village. Was Oakridge a place caught between worlds? Or had it all been a twisted illusion meant to haunt him forever? He couldn't answer these questions. He only knew one thing. He would never forget the village, its cold streets, and the eyes that watched him from the shadows. Before he disappeared into the mist, he turned back to the empty field, his heart heavy with the unanswered mysteries. And with that, one last thought crossed his mind, a question that might never be answered. Do you think Oakridge was real, or just a figment of his imagination? If you've experienced something as strange or mysterious as Lucas did, let us know your thoughts. What do you think happened to Oakridge? Drop your comments below. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay updated with our latest mysterious stories. Keep exploring the unknown with us.